Hello, and welcome to the Actual Magician's Bookshelf. Yes, I am an actual magician. And in this episode, we're going to be continuing our look at the Tree of Life, the Kabbalah. This is lesson 3 in the sequence. So we're going to be taking a look at the paths around Malkuth and Yesod that we've covered in the previous 2 lessons. I thought instead of moving to Hod and Netzach and Tiferet, and look at the rest of the tree in general, we're going to take a look at the important difference between the paths and the Sephiroth in terms of our own mental health, our spiritual well-being, and the map itself to keep it clean and clear as we build up our knowledge. It's best to have these lessons at the beginning so that you don't build bad habits, bad mental habits when you're thinking about the Tree of Life. And we've covered the important things in the first 2 lessons. 2 very important things. One is that the Sephiroth are not real things, that this is a model like everything else. And we also looked at the fact that Malkuth is not here. That's the interaction between Yesod and Malkuth that we looked at in the first 2 lessons. That the world card itself, the tarot card, is an illustration of the map in terms of its relationship with us and whatever reality is, which is Malkuth, which is also Kether, because these are identical, because everything is one thing, and this is a extended model of how we experience the reflective nature of existing as a self in the universe, as if those 2 things are separative. So what we're going to take a look at is the paths, and in particular we're going to take a look at the tarot cards of the world, the moon, Judgement, the blasted tower, and temperance. And I've covered this before in several videos. It's the model of Kesheth, the rainbow on the Tree of Life, but I want to place it in context in these lessons so that we learn a bit about the difference between the paths and the Sephiroth. In traditional Kabbalah, in the Sephiroth, all of these are referred to as the paths. So there are in effect 32 paths, the 10 Sephiroth and the 22 paths themselves, but they're sometimes referred to as paths, sometimes as channels, and that gives us a different metaphor really for how the Tree of Life exists. And we're also going to be taking a look at another practical way of utilizing the Tree of Life in our everyday life as well as a map and a model. Then we're going to move on in our next lesson perhaps to some more magical ways of using the Tree of Life and correspondence in practical magic as well. And I think I've covered that in a few other videos as well, but we're going to place it in a nice beginner's sequence so we get the foundation, which is, if you recall, the actual meaning of Yesod down first, so that we're always building on a good foundation. So we are taking a look at, we have Malkuth, the kingdom, we have Yesod, the foundation, and we have Hod and Netzach up here, but we also have these lines, and these lines, the paths or the channels, are actually the relationship between the unknowable Sephiroth. So on the Tree of Life we have a lightning flash of creation that is like a sword, often depicted as the sword at the Gate of Eden, coming down the tree, which is the tree, the map, the Kabbalah used as a map of how creation is arising in existence, from existence to existence as existence, coming down the tree, down, depending on which way the tree is up. And then we have the paths, which are seen quite often as a serpent of wisdom on the Tree of Life. You'll obviously get the biblical allusion to that, coming up and sneaking up the Tree of Life, because the snake is the snake of knowledge that takes us up the tree. And because the snake is on the paths, and because the paths are the relationship between the Sephiroth, the creative, divine, unknowable 10 aspects of the unified, manifest existence, the universe as we experience it, then the paths then are the lesson or experience as we experience it, as our perceptions are. So this is why these are also in the tarot, these are quite often referred to as the archetypes, or the major arcana of the archetypes. Now, again, we know from our Poe thinking that nothing is something else. It's only an equivalency. So the major arcana are not the archetypes. At best, we could describe these as illustrative of a certain type of archetype that the card illustrates, the pattern tends towards. So the pattern of the archetype of the world is the sort of unitative pattern, is the world figure, is the mother figure, the goddess figure, all sorts of other patterns, and that tends to those types of patterns, whereas the blasted tower tends towards patterns of destruction, patterns of downfall, patterns of stories about human pride, arrogance, and so forth, and God's wrathful judgment, or plans coming awry, and so forth. Now, this card can illustrate those patterns, those archetypes, those universal experiences, but this card tends towards all of those meanings more than this one. And so why there are 78 or 22 major arcana, 78 cards in total, stabilized like that, who knows? I think it's because we have 10 fingers, and we tend to think in dualistic patterns, and all sorts of other things just happen to stabilize our man-made map of the universe, or person-made map of the universe, in a particular sort of way. And that's as far as I understand it. So we have the cards then are corresponding to these paths, to these channels, to the lessons, the challenges, and the resources, which is why I teach it that way in tarot, between the Sephiroth. And all we can know to some extent about the Sephiroth, about the nature of Yesod, our unconscious, our psyche, our ego process that arises, our memory and our resonance to the universe and our particular pattern to it, arises from the world. So everything to do with our closeness, our comprehensive, congruent and consistent model of the universe, and the gap between that internal map and model and our personality, our behavior, our understanding and knowledge of the world and our wisdom about it, is reflected in the world around us. And whether we are close to the truth and the world card is vibrating, is resonant fully and properly, or whether our life is a mess and all over the place and fragmented and partial and confused, that is to some extent merely the relationship, a measure of the relationship that we have in the world between our internal model, Yesod, our foundation, and the world as it exists. So if you have a totally illusory view of the world, a even psychotic or schizophrenic view, or there's patterns in the way you see the world where the world really doesn't appear to have those patterns, those events, those facts and reality, then you're always going to see that manifest in the world around you and your relationship to it. Now, having said that, we can now expand our model to include the last Judgement card, or the Judgement card that is on this path here, and the Moon card, which is on this path here. So let's just take a quick look at those cards individually, and we can see that we have the moon, which is often the card of cyclic patterns, of reflection. It only reflects the light. It's also a card of fear and anxiety and dreams and the path less travelled and so forth. And as my second occult teacher used to say, the crayfish never leaves the water here. It's always in its shell, protected, whereas the Judgement card is very different. The Judgement card is a calling, is a rebirth. We are now entering into a new life beyond the grave even, and there is a above and below that are in a better relationship than the below here and the above here. Here we have reflected light and the animalistic nature and even the very primitive reptilian hindbrain, the sort of crustacean brain at the back of our heads, the one that belongs back in the ocean. And we have the journey, we have reflected light, but it isn't the full light, whereas here we have the full divine presence, the calling, the name, the sound of the reality calling us, and we have the human triad at the bottom, whereas here we have the animalistic triad on this side. And also, if we look at these cards here, we have the letters L, V, and these hands are technically crossed to make LVX, which is light, which is part of a ritual of the Golden Dawn. So these two cards are same but different, same but different. And that is because of their positions on the Tree of Life. So let's come and take a look at those and see how they go. So the moon is on this side of the tree, which is the side coming down this pillar, and the Last Judgment is on this side of the tree coming down from Hod. So this is sort of the energetic side, and this is the structural side. This is fire force and everything outgoing, and this is the passive reception to those. So we can see them as the active and passive pillars in their function, and then the middle pillar is the harmonizing pillar in the middle. But down here then we have Hod, which is the lowest form of structure. This is the mind when we look at it in terms of a map of our psychology. And here we have on the other side, for a simplistic model at least of our psychology, we have feelings and emotions and a sort of cyclic nature here with a more direct nature on this side. This to me in my head feels like a Connect 4 board, where when you drop things into it, it always has to go in the pattern that is set out for it, like a matrix. And matrix, mother, womb, all of that formation stuff happens way up there, but Hod is our lowest form of that in a sense. And then on this side, Netzach is the vibrant output of nature itself, is the cyclic nature of things. It is our emotions that are constantly moving and energetic, whereas our thoughts tend to be the things that then have to follow our feelings, because our feelings come first. Our thoughts are merely the thinking about what we're feeling and what we're experiencing, and they happen in tandem, but on the creative side of things, the model says that our feelings come first. Our emotional life, our almost primitive response to the universe, fear, flight, and freeze reactions, all of these sorts of things are constantly at the back of our head being energetic, and our thoughts and our feeling and our rational side is constantly trying to model them and make sense of them, come up with a narrative to form our memory and so forth. So the Last Judgment card, that more rational side, as we saw the three human figures on it, reflected in the background of the Last Judgment card, is on this side, and the more lunar animalistic side is on this side where we have our emotions. Then we have this triad going on, and now we can see that we have the Last Judgment, the moon and the world, and these are all operating all of the time. This is a map of exactly what is happening right now. It's more of a verb than a noun. It's not the tree of life. It's the living life modelled as a tree that is happening constantly, even now as we speak. And as you watch this video, it's happening around you, and this is just a model for it. So let's just close that triangle then at the bottom of the tree of life, and we put across here this path here, and I'm just going to fill these in a little bit. That one there, that one there, just so that we're clear how we're looking at this on a model. We now have this bottom triangle here. So we have this bottom triangle with this pendant at the bottom, and it's the Blasted Tower card that goes across there, the Blasted Tower between Hod and Netzach. And now we can see the functionality. We can tell a little bit about the relationship of Hod and Netzach, even if we don't know what those words mean. If I said to you, well, there are two things, and when they are working together, both well and not so well, in balance and not in balance, this is the picture, and it's on a sideways path between two objects, two parts of a machine, and this is the manual for that part of the machine. This is how we operate that part of the machine. And so basically it's building and breaking. I sometimes ask people when I'm introduced to a new child in a family and so forth, and one of my first questions is always not what gender or their behaviour. I always ask, are they a builder or a breaker? And I've always found, strangely enough, although I was really terrified to ask the question to begin with, over the years I've found that you can tell if it's a builder or a breaker fairly quickly. And this card is, are you a builder or a breaker? And we're all always parts of each, but this card is the building and breaking card that is constantly going on. It's the entire pattern of the universe building and breaking constantly in existence. And that then functions as the repeated cycles of the universe come down this side, the pattern of the universe, the calling of the above and the below, and the structure of all human experience in the Last Judgment goes up here, and we constantly have this going on, and this makes up our world. Now, you'll already hopefully be wondering what these two paths here are and what that path is above. We'll take a look at that path in a moment, and then we're going to look at those two paths when we look at Hod and Netzach, because in our next lesson we can start to look at these things more structurally, more holistically, because it's very important, and this is my real lesson in our lesson today, to think about the paths and the Sephiroth as holistic, as an engine, as a activity, as a relationship of things going on all of the time. Once that is in your head, it makes the rest of the language of Kabbalah far easier to learn and far more relevant, far more practical to reality and useful in your everyday experience. Just learning these as things, as something that you have to learn and remember and recall as if it's some actual thing, well, you're never going to find this in existence, not quite like this unless you see a picture of it, but these are patterns and these are relationships, and it's a useful model of seeing the world and integrating it into your life. And that's why it's important to think of them in pairs, think of them in relationships. When you think about the moon card, always think about it as being arising out of Netzach and Malkuth. If you switch Netzach off or Malkuth off, then the moon cannot arise. The moon does not exist as a pattern in nature. And if Netzach is out of sync with something, whether that's Hesed or Tifreth or Hod, then this part is where it manifests. It's a bit like if something's wrong in a car sometimes, or a body, then, or a mind, sometimes that emerges, it's referred to another part of the system, and that's where the symptoms arise for the thing itself. So these are like the symptoms of, and the measurement therefore, and a health check on the rest and the calibration of all of the other parts of our universe. So Blaster Tower runs across here. It's an illustration of the relationship between these two unknowable parts of nature and ourselves. Whenever there's something awry in somebody's feelings and their thoughts about it, you'll get the Blasted Tower in their reading, in their spread. And again, this is where it becomes a useful model, a very practical model in tarot card readings. It means that every tarot card reading you do will always be a map of all of the patterns around that person and the disjuncture or fragmentation or imbalance between these parts. If you suddenly have like the Last Judgment and the World and the Blasted Tower, those cards in that person's reading, you know that their issues are all down here. And then you can contextualize them. You can have a framework for understanding them. Similarly up here or down this side or in the middle or none of them. All of that will tell you something about the real patterns that underpin all of existence, because quite often in magic people are told, oh, you'll be able to discover and manipulate the mysteries of matter, the secrets of existence. And to some extent that is true. That is the prime purpose, or one of the purposes of magic, is to understand reality. And this is where we start. We have to learn the language of reality, and that language is our experience mapped to some consistent, congruent and comprehensive model. And this is the model I tend to use, Kabbalah, through correspondence, the Western Esoteric and History system, therefore to alchemy and astrology and numerology, and then it all hangs together, and then you learn something every day to tweak the model. And therefore your understanding of the patterns and to some extent your ability to manipulate is the wrong word. It's more like relate to the universe improves or should improve as a result of this. Sometimes you have to break it down to build it up. Sometimes things can be out of balance because you're trying to work on one side and not the other. But generally speaking, you have a good map to do it. So the Blasted Tower, the Moon, the Last Judgment, and the World. And we have Temperance, which is in the middle here. So that is an illustration. I think we've looked at this perhaps in the last session, and we can see that Temperance is in effect the illustration, just looking at the screen here, so I can see what I'm pointing at. So we have Temperance is on this path between 6 and 9, which are obviously reversed numbers. And the Sun here is the Sun that corresponds to Tifreth. The triangle is obviously the triangle there. And the 2 cups are the Hod and Netzach coming down the tree. The crown of Kether is in the background there, and the water and the earth are the dualities down at the bottom here. Now the iris here is interesting, as is the figure, because quite often people say that this is an angel or an angelic figure, but actually it's not. Temperance here is depicted as a winged figure bearing goblets which is actually the goddess Iris. And Iris is doubly referred to because we have the irises here. And Iris is the messenger goddess. She is the goddess of the rainbow. And the reason that that is on that card in this position here, so this is, I'll just put temperance there. In that position there is because the Hebrew letters that correspond to the moon, and to say I've done this in other videos, but I want this here for reference. My pen's just about to run out. So we have Kaf relates to the moon. Shin corresponds, meaning tooth, corresponds to the Last Judgment. And incidentally, the Hebrew letter, let me get a pencil for this. The Hebrew letter for Shin, looks like teeth, I guess, is exactly the three figures arising out of the tombs on the Last Judgment card. And that's more clear in the Golden Dawn description of the card than Waite made it clear, because he didn't really want to give that away. But the Shin symbol is actually embedded into the card. Crowley actually, in the Thoth Tarot, embedded the Hebrew letters and geomantic symbols far more than Waite did. And Waite in the Major Arcana was really trying to have the Catholic mysteries and mysticism depicted, whereas Crowley was going far more for the magical side of things. So Waite was going for the mystical side of things, Crowley was going for the magical side of things. And then Tau, meaning cross, corresponds to the world card, And Kaf, Shin and Tau, those Hebrew letters, actually make a word. They spell out a word in Hebrew, in the everyday Hebrew language and in biblical Hebrew language. And that word, as you'll know from any of my other videos on the subject, is rainbow. And Kaf, Shin and Tau make the formula of the rainbow, and that rainbow is the one that acts as the covenant or the bridge between the world above and the world below. Now, quite interestingly, when we also look at correspondences and the way they resonate together, Hebrew is a language, correspondences are correspondences. Tarot cards emerged in Italy and stabilized as 22 major arcana and the minor arcana and the court cards. Astrology and the symbols and the glyphs of astrology have been used since Babylonian times, Sumerian times, very ancient science and art, a lot older than tarot, that's for sure. And interestingly enough, when we correspond the zodiac and the signs of the zodiac and the planets in astrology to the cards, temperance corresponds to Sagittarius. And Sagittarius, as you'll know, has the glyph of an arrow like so. So Sagittarius. And temperance ends up on this path, on the tree of life. And then we can see really clearly that it then makes the sign of temperance is actually drawn in the position where temperance actually is. And then you can see temperance and Sagittarius and the line actually made by the water actually in the card itself. Isn't that really spooky? It just shows how resonating these symbols are, and the science of correspondence and its art actually work together. They are layered upon layered, and you can find in everyday life, these resonances, these powerful resonances, once you start to structure your thinking, your observation, your map of the world through correspondence, and this is the real power and secret of correspondence and of all magic itself in Western Esotericism. I cannot stress, even if I have to stress it in every single video, that correspondence is the heart of the Western esoteric industry system, certainly as I teach it. And it is important to learn it and use it way from the beginning, because it will have so many rewards and dividends in your thinking and your experience, your magical, spiritual, mystical, psychological, and manifest experience. The more you use it, it has immediate benefits when we look at the inner guide meditation, and then you can apply it and engage it with the world around you. And yes, you can do magical rituals. You can summon the 8th angel of the 4th abyss from the 3rd plane of the demi-planes of the crooked path. You can do all of that, but this will actually give you a magical experience in everyday life almost constantly as you develop it and as you work through it. And it is something that is sustainable and manageable and far more balanced, although not perfect, because none of us are perfect, over time, over a long period of time. And I say this from 45 years of observing myself, other magicians, the occult world in general, long before the internet, during the internet. I don't think I'll ever observe it after the internet, but certainly to date, this is what I would hold by in my experience and observations of all of the books and all of the learning and the people around me and the people I observe online and so forth. Correspondence is the saving grace at the heart of all things, as far as I'm concerned, and that's why it's good to learn it. Whatever helps you learn it is best. If you think it's a bit of fun, learn it as a bit of fun. If you want to learn it as a challenge, then learn it as a challenge. If you think it might be useful, then learn it for that. Whatever it takes to learn it is good. So we have Kesheth at the bottom of the Tree of Life, and we have Temperance arising up out of it. And really this is where the paths and the Sephiroth are working together, and we see this map working together. So again, if you've not yet learnt the names of the Sephiroth, the attribution of the major arcana, the 22 of them, to the paths, and then the spelling of the Sephiroth, and then because you then know the correspondences of the Hebrew letters to the 22 major arcana, as well as their position on the path, then you can look at Kether as Kaf, Tau, and Resh. You should, by this 3rd lesson, over time, obviously taking your own time to learn these things, now be able to build up the illustration of Kether as the wheel, the world, and the sun. So that's basically the entire unitative process of the universe, the manifest existence of the universe itself, and all of the light that exists in the universe. And basically the combination of those 3 things make Kether, make Malkuth, and so forth. So I'll leave you with that for now. I just wanted this 3rd lesson to really instill the idea, the importance of correspondence, the way correspondence can resonate between systems, the nature of the Sephiroth as the creative process coming down the tree, the nature of the paths as our resource, a challenge, and our lesson, which is the way I teach the 3-minute method of learning the tarot, as each card for a challenge, resource, and a lesson. and seeing that illustrated by each of the paths and each of the illustrated tarot cards that correspond to those paths. So if you'd like some homework, and you can put this in the comments below if you want spoilers for other students, let's jump up the Tree of Life and perhaps have a think, if you've got the rest of this, without knowing much about Gibora and Hesed, what is the card here? And what does it illustrate, perhaps, about the relationship of Hesed and Gibora? And, as a bonus question, an intermediate to advanced question, how does that then relate to its lower resonance of the Blasted Tower between Netzach and Hod? How does this card have similarities and differences and resonances between this card? Because we have three cards that illustrate the balance between Bina and Hokmah, Gibor and Hesed, and Hod and Netzach on the Tree of Life. And if you know some stuff about this one, then you can look at this one in a similar light, and then this one in a higher light, and look at all three of them as being the fundamental balancing lessons, resources, and challenges on the Tree of Life, but more importantly, in our life as well. That we are constantly the rungs of the ladder of our spiritual work, of our work towards initiation, work towards a more unitative state, comprehensive, congruent, and consistent. We have three rungs on a ladder on the picture. And so if we understand those three tarot cards and study those for the rest of our lives, then the Blasted Tower, this card, which you can do as homework, and then this card on here correspond to those three rungs that we are constantly climbing up between Malkuth and Kether in order to bring them all together as one thing in the end. So I hope you find this useful, relevant, and interesting, and it inspires you to perhaps look at the cards in a slightly different way in terms of them illustrating the relationships between Sephiroth on the Tree of Life. And then we can come to look at the Sephiroth a little bit more, because we know what's in between them. We know it's a bit like a game of cosmic battleships where we know where they're not, so we know the shape that they must have to be where they are not, because then it makes the entire model make sense and hold together. So thanks a lot. I look forward to seeing you in next week's lesson. For those watching this at the time, or roughly at the time of the recording itself, I've got a big, huge announcement about our tarot work on Sunday. I'm going to be doing a YouTube live to announce something Tolly Goodwin and I have been working on and off on for 8 years. And it's a new course, a tarot course, and it's with an accompanying book that has very groundbreaking, I believe it's groundbreaking, research and information about the Waite-Smith Tarot and the Tarot in general, and the Western Esoteric History system as I teach it as well. And I'm going to be doing a live and an Ask Me Anything style thing here on YouTube, live on Sunday, which will be the 16th of February, and that will be at 10 p.m. UK time, and it will be available obviously as a recording here on YouTube afterwards as well. So thanks a lot, and as ever, the worker is hidden in the workshop.